Well, it's a hard rain, it's a purple rain. Taps the levee and leaves a stain.
Hey, everybody, I'm Mark Finkelpearl. This is Jeffrey Himes, and welcome to Hard Rain and Pink Cadillacs. Today is Pat Sansone. You know Pat from his many years in Wilco, and you might also know Pat from his longtime side project called the Autumn Defense. We were also going to meet with John Stirrett, who is half of Autumn Defense and is the bass player in Wilco. But he was called away at the last moment. And we missed John, but frankly, it gave us a lot more time to go very deep with Pat Sansone, and that was a lot of fun. Jeff, what are your thoughts on Pat?
Yeah, I thought that there was a really good deep dive into using strings in rock and roll, which is one of my favorite topics, and what works and what doesn't work. And I was glad to hear that he has his own radio show that deals with this kind of chamber pop that I'm so fond of, and obviously he's so fond of. And I was also glad he talked about you know growing up in the South and sort of falling in love with the music of London in the 60s, and just as the way the Beatles and Stones grew up in London and fell in love with the music of Memphis in the 50s. So I thought we went off the usual kind of interview stuff into some really, good territory, I thought.
Here's the Hard Rain and Pink Cadillacs conversation with Pat Sansone. Hey, everybody, it's Pat Sansone. You know Pat from Autumn Defense and, of course, from his work in Wilco. Pat, thank you so much for joining us on Hard Rain and Pink Cadillacs. We're glad to have you.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
So, very recently, I interviewed you and John for Premier Guitar. We talked a lot about your gear and the vintage instruments that you're into. Um, and that drops for anybody interested in print in the January 2026 issue of Premier Guitar. You can find that at premierguitar.com. And one of the things that I learned about you in that during that process was a lot more about your background in Meridian and the fact that you come from a very musical family. Meridian, Mississippi is on the border with Alabama. Let's start there. Tell us a little bit about that and how you grew up in that world and environment.
Well, I two things. I mean, number one, Meridian is just kind of uh, you know, certainly when I was growing up, a very musical place. I mean, I that's where I grew up. I lived there from I was born there, and I lived there until I went off to college, which wasn't very far from there, just a couple of hours away. So that's what I knew as a young person. And so I didn't, it didn't seem unusual to me growing up there, but looking back on it, I realized just how much of a musical soul Meridian has. And my family was just a very musical family. My mother sang and sang around in groups around our town, had just an amazing voice, loved jazz. So I heard her singing a lot of jazz around the house, and she sang with some groups in town that kind of did pop hits of the day and different things. And my grandmother on my dad's side was a singer and played piano. When she was young, she was a professional singer and making a go of it, traveling and singing on some radio shows, couple of radio shows out of New Orleans. So I kind of grew up hearing stories about that. My father was a concert promoter in our hometown, which even though Meridian is a small town of about, I think when I was growing up there, it was a town of about 60,000 people, something in that range. Um, we had a beautiful old theater right in the heart of downtown, and he, starting in the mid 60s, started promoting concerts, which kind of turned into an annual arts festival every spring. So I just grew up getting to see a lot of legendary performers, people like Ray Charles and Roberta Flack and Carl Perkins and Tony Bennett and the Little River Band. And, it was a pretty varied roster of entertainers that he booked. And this was in the 70s, and I was born in 69. So, kind of growing up in the 70s, going down to that theater and seeing all these legendary acts and being able to see it from the wings because my dad was the promoter and kind of, just sort of hanging around the stage and, hanging out with the stage hands and watching the sound checks and hanging out in the ticket booth, all of it, just kind of seeing it from soup to nuts, as my grandmother would say. So that was just a big part of my growing up and my sort of the things that I appreciated in the world. My whole family loved music and entertainment and the arts, and that's kind of just how I was formed, really.
Can I ask you, what specifically about Mississippi sort of sunk home during that period? Is it
Well, I mean,
teenager?
I didn't really appreciate it at the time,
Mhm.
because as I was, when I started to kind of, you know, when I'm, 11, 12, and, 13, starting to kind of form my own sort of world and my own personality and worldview, I was in a dream world very far away from Mississippi. I was obsessed with the Beatles. And, in my dream world, I was living in 1967 in London and hanging out with Paul McCartney and Ray Davies and Pete Townsend. Uh, and but I started to, I think a few things happened. First of all, I discovered the music of Big Star when I was about 13, 14 years old. And that was a real revelation for me because Big Star were from Memphis, just a few hours north of where I grew up in Meridian. And I had cousins in Memphis. I had been to Memphis, I didn't go to London until I was 30 years old. So to discover Big Star's brilliant music and recognize the ties to the Beatles and that English rock that I was already obsessed with, but also just the realization that they were from my neck of the woods, that was huge for me and gave me a lot of permission, I think, at that age to kind of be who I was, and be interested in the music that I was interested in and kind of follow that path. It's
So,
very impact.
so it sort of gave you the idea that you didn't have to live in London to make records.
Yeah, you could be from the South and do cool things, And looking at the back cover of Number One Record and just seeing how cool they looked, they, with those scarves and, Jody Stevens just looking so cool. And they all, it's like, man, like you can be from Memphis and be this cool. And also REM, like I was 13 when Murmur came out and I saw them when they debuted on David Letterman and that was a big moment for me too. It's like, I went out and bought Murmur, I think the next day. And that had a big impact on me as well. So, that started to give me a little bit broader attitude about the South and being an artist in the South,
Mm-hmm.
or, what, being a creative, sensitive soul in the South.
So
Um,
what were your high school friends listening to at that time?
well, there was a small group of us that were into,
Mm-hmm.
into, cool music. I mean,
Right.
but it was a pretty small gang. There were a few punk rockers, maybe three or four, and some skaters, and me and my other kind of nerdy friends that were, listening to, Husker Du and the Replacements and REM and stuff. But we were a small band of outsiders, and we stuck together. But
Mm-hmm.
then when I went to college, and I went to college at University of Southern Mississippi in Hattiesburg, in 1988, that was a big revelation as well, because that USM was a public university, but it was kind of like the liberal arts school. It's kind of where all the artsy weirdo Mississippi kids went to college. So we were all thrown together in this little town, Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and a lot of bands started there. There was a really fertile creative moment. Just when I think back on it, so many bands and bands doing some pretty original, kind of out there things. I mean, it was, it, in a way, I think it was sort of similar maybe to what it must have felt like to be in Athens, Georgia in the mid 80s, or Chapel Hill, these kind of southern, these little towns of southern Bohemia. We had that happening in Hattiesburg. It didn't have the visibility that those other towns had. We were still kind of in our own little world, but it was a really creative environment.
So, Pat, we want to talk about the new record, but you know, before we do that, let's set the table. I think a lot of fans believe that, the Autumn Defense is just a side project that happened after you joined Wilco. That's not really the case. It predates your time in Wilco. Um, Tell us how you met John Stearett and how that all happened in the first place.
Well, John and I met through this kind of scene that I'm talking about, the college music scene in Mississippi, just in the Deep South in the late 80s, early 90s. John was living in Oxford, Mississippi, uh, during the time that I was in Hattiesburg. He was going to Ole Miss. I was going to USM. I actually became buddies with John's twin sister, Laurie Stearett, before I met John, because Laurie was in a great band called Blue Mountain that used to play in Hattiesburg a lot. So I'd go see Blue Mountain. I think my, you know, bands that I was in at the time, probably we might have played on the same bill with them. We were all, if you were in a band, an underground band in that area back then, you knew all the other bands. So we were buddies from that music scene.
Before you
And,
go on, can you talk a little bit about, I mean, Blue Mountain has always been one of my favorite bands, and talk about, what it was like to see them back in 89, 88, 89, when they were, or I guess they were still the Hilltops then, and then in 91, 92 they were Blue Mountain, and
yeah,
uh,
yeah.
what made that an important band that's somehow not gotten the credit it deserved.
Well, I mean, they were writing original songs, and they were putting out records. I mean, just that alone was a pretty big deal. And so, this was what was really great about that time period and the scene, is that there was a lot of inspiration happening, between us. Like, we'd see Blue Mountain, like, oh wow, they actually made a record. You can make a record and write your own songs and do that. Well, I guess we can do that too. Um, and they were just a great live band. I mean, Carrie Hudson, the her partner in that band, and was a great guitar player. He was a great slide player. They were just a cool band, cool songs, and really powerful trio. Had made a big sound for
Mhm.
a trio,
But
kind of a classic.
you never saw the Hilltops then.
I think I saw the Hilltops once, and it was at a festival that I had a band. I was in a band called Stretch Armstrong, which was kind of a real heavy rock band, and I think we played on a radio station festival that they were on, but I think they were headlining the festival, so I think we had to leave early. But I remember catching a little bit of their set, but I didn't really know the Hilltops.
Mhm.
I didn't really get to know Laurie until the Blue Mountain days, and then
But
at
but
some
John
point,
but that band, just for listeners, was John and Laurie and Carrie,
right,
right? Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
exactly. And they were pretty legendary. They were definitely, because they were played a lot, so they were playing a lot of the same clubs that we were playing, so we'd see their names on the listings. And so but I did meet John. I remember meeting John in Hattiesburg. He came to town for something, and we hung out a little bit. But then John and I got to know each other uh more when I moved after I left Hattiesburg, and I moved to New Orleans, and I lived there for about 4 or 5 years. And John had moved back to New Orleans as well. And this was in the very early stages of Wilco. I think maybe Wilco had put out AM. Uh, Maybe we're working on being there. I can't remember to be sure, but it was kind of in that period. Um, and I was living in New Orleans, John was living there, and we just kind of reconnected somehow. I think my memory is that we just kind of kept running into each other around town at shows and record stores and guitar shops and stuff. So he and I, yeah, we just became buddies. We started to
Mhm.
talk about records, and we quickly realized that we were just very much on the same wavelength, taste wise, about the
Mhm.
stuff that we were collecting, the stuff that we were getting excited about, the music that we were digging into. He also had this interest in this love in this music that I was like really preoccupied with. And
Mhm.
that's what brought us together,
Okay.
um, because I think it was unique in that time period, in that place. There just weren't a whole lot of people talking about the Zombies and Scott Walker and
Mhm.
hanging around New Orleans in 90, in the now we're talking like the late 90s. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to look back and say, because like I grew up in Mississippi, just in this in that energy, this kind of like, like knee deep in it, and it was influencing me in ways that I didn't even understand consciously
Mhm.
at the time. As much as I was maybe trying to fight it,
Mhm.
it was still getting in there. And I love your Jimmy Rogers t-shirt, by the way, representing Meridian. I love it.
So
Uh,
so in retrospect, how were those things affecting you, even though you didn't realize it?
I think just in the air, I think
Mhm.
just the pace of life, the way time kind of stretches and is sort of elongated, like growing up in the deep South. Uh, and just kind of being influenced by proxy by um, you know, just being there.
Mhm.
You can't really get away with you can't get away from it. And like, and growing up, going down to the theater that my dad would book
Mhm.
shows. They booked country music too, and so I heard a lot of great country music pickers down there at the theater. And
Mhm.
that was getting into my musical DNA as
Mhm.
well. and
Mhm.
and you know P- PV Electronics was based in Meridian, Mississippi. And you know the PV Electronics is the sound of country music,
Mhm.
in the 1970s and 80s. So that was just it was just around me. So I think as when I got older and and started to appreciate country music more, especially classic country music, um, then I could, like, in hindsight, go, "Oh yeah,
Okay.
I'm really fortunate that I I grew up where I grew up." So in a way, it's so many of these British rockers that I idolized as a teenager, and still do. They all dreamed about Mississippi.
Right.
They were collecting these blues records, and they had this kind of like sort of dream mythical
Right.
idea of what Mississippi was like, while I'm a kid in Mississippi, like having this, mythical dream space of where
Can
they were from. So
right. Can you explain why you were so entranced with this scene that was like flourishing before you were born, 4,000 miles away?
not really. I don't, there's something, I mean, I think, well, when you talk about the Beatles, you just can't, it's just undeniably brilliant, culture changing art. And it just really hit me. I mean, the the moment that I got hit with the Beatle rays was when John Lennon was killed, and that was in 1980. So I was 10.
Uh-huh.
And I mean, obviously, a kid growing up in the 70s, you hear Beatles music, it's on the radio, people are covering the Beatles. I'm sure half the artists that played down the theater that, I mean, I'm sure, Ray Charles might have done Eleanor Rigby,
Mm-hmm.
at that concert, or, Hey Jude was probably sung, so you hear the Beatles. But we didn't have any Beatle albums in our home, like my mom or dad, neither one, like, bought any Beatle records. But when John Lennon was killed, uh, and that was on the news, and that started to hear that music, for the next week or so, like kind of on constant replay, it just captured me. I mean, that was it. As soon as I heard it, it was like I was encountering a music that I somehow already knew, but was also incredibly eye-opening and world opening at the same time. And like I'll never forget hearing, having my little cassette player and with little cheap headphones, and
Mm-hmm.
hearing I Am the Walrus for the first time, and my little brain just cracking open. And yeah, never been the same since. So
I find it's real
so that
interesting. Really interesting the point you made about, um, you know, you're in Mississippi dreaming about London in 1966, and you know, John Lennon and Mick Jagger are in London 1966 dreaming about Mississippi and Memphis,
Elvis, yeah, and
yeah,
Elvis in Memphis, yeah,
in 1955. So
yeah.
there's this, I think there's this thing that happens in music where, um, somehow to get into the future, it's easier to go through the past because,
Mm,
especially a past that's far away, so you can sort of like manipulate the past to fit whatever your needs of
mm,
expression are, and and,
mm,
and you try to, and in trying to imitate that past and getting it wrong, you come up with
hmm.
something new. So
That's a great way to put it. Yeah, I mean, I think, it was way easier to sort of like go into dream time with that music, because it was happening from an earlier era, and it wasn't something, that you're like faced with in real time. So yeah, it kind of allows you to go into sort of a dream space and kind of like uh yeah, find your own place, as a creative, as a dreamer. So um yeah, that's a very interesting way to put it. Yeah, I think that's right on.
I was just a couple years ahead of you, Pat. So I'm born in 67. You're born in 69, and I was experiencing the same thing up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And my take on it is that a lot of it has to do with the generation, where we sit in the Gen X generation, because really we very much cusp with the end of the baby boomers,
Hmm.
and who ended in 64, right? That's the last year of baby boomer. And
Okay.
so, in a way, all the kids in the neighborhood, all the big brothers, big sisters, they're all listening to this music anyway. And we're sort of exposed to it because of where we sit in the generational continuum of
Hmm.
American culture and musical culture, certainly.
Hmm. Yeah.
So, but um, so at some point, you and John, and we do want to talk about the new record. It took you guys your first new record in 11 years. But at some point, you and John decide we're going to make this album. This is around the year 2000. It's the first Autumn Defense record. Do you remember that moment of spark that turned into the first record?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, John and I were becoming buddies, like, just kind of hanging out and talking about records and things. And at some point, I have a really distinct memory of going over to he had this cool apartment in the French Quarter where he was renting for a while, and going over to his place and sitting around strumming acoustic guitars and learning the chords to a couple of songs from Forever Changes, Love's Forever Changes, which are pretty complicated, and have some kind of obtuse chord changes, and it was really fun. And we were singing together, we were we were singing some harmonies together, and it just was like, wow, I'm strumming Forever Changes songs here, and we're singing together, and we had a good vocal blend immediately. And that was really, I think, the moment where we were like, okay, we're on the same we're on the same wavelength here, and we should probably do something together. And John had already had an album's worth of songs basically kind of in the works that he had already written. Some, I think they were pretty fully formed, but some might have been, you know, f- all the way finished. Maybe some were almost finished. And I think he and Jay Bennett might have started a project, kind of working on a project together at some point that didn't pan out. So he had songs with no home at that time and wanted to figure out something to do with them. And I was working at a recording studio. I was part of a kind of a clubhouse recording studio in Uptown in New Orleans, where I was working on some of my own music, and I was, engineering and doing sessions and stuff. And I was also doing sessions at a studio called Kingsway, which was Daniel Lanois' studio. Sort of after he still owned it, but he had kind of left and was starting. I think he had started Teatro Studios in California. So I was sort of shuffling back and forth between these two recording studios, doing sessions and just figuring out my scene. And so I invited him over to the studio and said, "Hey, let's kind of look at these songs." And we demoed them, and I think I helped him, sort of shape a few of the things. But that was the material that became the first Autumn Defense record. And we booked a session at Kingsway Studio for, I think we were in there for a week. And Ken Coomer, who, the original drummer from Wilco, he
Right.
played drums, and and we, had a couple other friends play with us, and we did half the record there at Kingsway in New Orleans. And shortly after that session, John moved to Chicago. This is in '99. John moved to Chicago, and I moved to Nashville, and we reconvened in Nashville at a great studio called Alex the Great, and got together some of our Nashville friends, including Ken Coomer, and we did the second half of the recordings there in Nashville. So that first record is John's material arranged and produced by me in New Orleans and Nashville. And then
So wait,
um,
so at that point, is John doing all the leads vocals then?
John is the lead singer on all of that first album. Yeah,
So
yeah.
what's interesting to me about your whole catalog actually is that is, as you mentioned earlier, is this vocal blend. And I'm curious. I mean, it sounds, to my ears, it sounds very Everly Brothers,
Mm.
like, that's, and John and Paul, which is of course rooted in the Everly Brothers. Um, and that, how did you get to that sound? Was it just instinctive, or did you work out parts, or you know, you know, were you like big fans of close harmony, or how did
Oh
that
yeah.
evolve?
Oh yeah. I mean, that was really the foundation of the whole thing. I mean, I think once we heard our vocal blend together sitting around strumming acoustics, that was the foundation for it. And so we knew that we wanted to have a lot of harmonies, Yeah, we love the Birds. You know, we both huge fans of the Birds, and of course the Everlys, and all that music, and Crosby, Stills, Nash. So harmony singing was something from the beginning that we wanted to emphasize in what we were doing.
Were the Beach Boys part of that mixture?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that was the stuff that that's just what we were, that's what was turning us on, like Beach Boys, the Hollies, the Zombies, the Birds, and looking for like obscure bands that, that you could only find, at the record, you had to ask the record store guy about, this is what we were excited about. So, and the Beach Boys, absolutely. I remember John and I going to see uh, one of the first performances of when Brian Wilson first started to revisit the Smile
Hmm.
music. Um, and we went to a show in New York. Like I want to say it was like 1999 or something, or 2000. It was really,
Yeah.
really early, and it was so good. And yeah, this was our universe, and this was what we wanted. We wanted to make records that could live, you know, the goal was to try to make records that could live next to those records. If you're shuffling through, on an evening of flipping, putting your records on the turntable.
Talk a little bit about how Arthur Lee and Love fit into that, because they're sort of apart from the bands we've just mentioned, Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and certainly the Beach Boys. But at the same time, they're a big influence on you. I did a deep dive on them recently after I talked to you guys for Premier Guitar, and I was completely blown away by this 1971 Lost Sessions record
Mm.
that's out there.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
It was just like some of the best psychedelic rock I've ever heard. They have a
Yeah.
real like they have a wide range. Arthur Lee had a pretty wide range. Tell us about your thoughts on all of that.
Well, I mean, the record that I know the most and that has had the most impact on me and John as well is Forever Changes. I mean, that
Hmm.
is just such a rich, strange, beautiful, eerie, and deep, deep record. I got that right. Actually, Lou Barlow had turned me on to that record because this was when I was in college, and I was in college for one semester up in Northampton, Mass. And I went into a record store one day, and he was there. I didn't know him. I knew who he was because I was a big Dinosaur Jr. fan. So I knew who he was, and I saw him. It's like, oh my God, that's Lou Barlow over there. And at some point, we just started chatting, and he just pulled a copy of Forever Changes out of the bin and handed it to me. He was like, "Do you know this record?" And I was like, "No." He's like, "Buy this record." So I bought the record, and and then I started a band because of it. But yeah, I mean, it's I was talking to somebody about this recently because I do a radio show. I do a weekly radio show called the Broke Down Palace, and the show focuses on what we're talking about. It focuses on music from the 1960s and 1970s that has orchestral elements, and I play rock, pop, folk, soul, and anything in between. And there's a lot in between in those
How
years.
can our audience hear that radio show, Pat?
They can go to baroquedownpalace.com, and it's a nationally public radio syndicated show, so it's on a handful of stations around the country, but it's produced out of a station in Memphis called WYXR. I record it here at home, right where I'm sitting in my studio. Um, but that's what the show focuses on. And when I started doing the show in 2020, uh, originally it was a 2-hour show, and I would do it once a month. And it became a little less regular because Wilco got back on the road, and then it became kind of whenever I could get them a show, they'd put it on. Now it's a weekly show, 1 hour a week. So I have to stay on top of it. And, originally it was kind of like, well, I might run out of things to play after, a year or two, but no way. No way. There's so much music from that time period across all those genres that it has amazing arranging. Um, kind of like what you were talking about, sort of the cusp of the generations. When these bands inspired, a lot by the Beatles and what they were doing with George Martin, when these bands were making records and kind of wanting to expand the palette, they had the luxury of having access to these arrangers from the previous generation that were still working and were still looking for work and had real formal arranging chops, you know. Um,
Like who?
so,
Who are you talking about?
well, like Jimmy Haskell, or um, a lot of names that I can't, a lot of,
Yeah.
especially in England, guys that had been arranging for BBC and
Mhm.
British television and film. Um,
Van Dyke Parks.
well, Van Dyke Parks, yeah, Van Dyke Parks was kind of he's kind of an anomaly because he was of their generation.
Okay.
He was of Brian Wilson's generation, but he's just a crazy, you know, magical, you know, mastermind,
Right.
and an incredible arranger and song cycle, his record Song Cycle. And he's from Mississippi. I don't know if you know that. And Van Dyke Parks
I
was
didn't know
born
that.
born in Hattiesburg, Mississippi.
Wow.
But I love, and the guy that arranged the strings for Forever Changes was an arranger named David Angel. And I just love the idea of these bands that, in 1965 were playing in a garage, like, banging out Hey Joe. And then 2 years later in 1967, they're working with a string ensemble, you know, arranged by some maybe kind of stuffy arranger who got hired for the gig. But the combination of those two things and like the tension that gets created by the
Mhm.
smashing of those two worlds together is just fascinating to me.
Yeah, this is something
And
that always fascinated me because, you know, there's a in some circles there's a prejudice against strings in rock and roll because it's always used to sort of soften up and smooth out the uh, rough edges of pop music. But then, as you say, there started being these records where strings were used in a different way, where they were sort of heightening emotion rather than smothering it. And
oh yeah.
can you talk a bit about how, strings are used effectively and badly in pop music and rock?
Um, well, I mean, that's a tough, I mean, effectively or badly. I mean, you know, my radio show is all about all of those things, and it's all taste. Like what one person might think is like super syrupy and cheeseball to another listener, it might be exactly the right thing for that track. I mean, a perfect example of that um is She's Leaving Home, uh by the on Sergeant Pepper.
Right.
That arrangement is the one arrangement up to that point. It was the first time they had a string arranger other than George Martin. And George Martin did the strings on Yesterday and did the strings on um,
Eleanor Rigby.
Eleanor Rigby and Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane. So he was their guy, and he's amazing arranger. But on She's Leaving Home, um, Paul was really hyped up to get that arrangement done, and George Martin was just busy that particular Thursday, and Paul wanted it. And so Paul said, okay, well, and got another arranger. And he got an arranger named Mike Leander to do it, who he had met because um, Marianne Faithfull had recorded a cover version of Yesterday, and Paul visited the session, and Mike Leander had arranged the strings for that. So he had met Mike Leander. So he said, well, I'll just get Mike Leander to do it. He's probably, so Mike did it. And it's a different kind of arrangement than what they had previously used. It's a little more flowery, it's a little more dramatic, it's a little more uh it just has a different tone. And like in Beatle world, there's a lot of chatter, people that, oh well, Sergeant Pepper's great, but that string arrangement for She's Leaving Home is just too cheesy, it's too flowery, it's just, it would have been better if George Martin had done it. But to me, it's the perfect arrangement for that song. It's the song itself is kind of a melodrama, it's almost like a BBC kitchen sink drama, what they call, it's a drama, it's a bit melodramatic. And to me, the fact that the strings are a little bit leading, they're a little bit, they're really emotional, they kind of almost sound like an old, like a soundtrack from an old film or something, with the harps and stuff. That's exactly what that song needs, and it's part of what pulls you into the story and the atmosphere of it. If it had been a colder, starker arrangement, it wouldn't have the same tone. So this is just
Yeah.
an example of like one, it's all taste. Uh Nico hated the strings and flutes on Chelsea Girl, her album Chelsea Girl, the record she made after she left the Velvet Underground. She discounted it, said, it, but to me, and most of us that love that album, a part of what we love about that album is those string arrangements, that the autumnal, the sort of like autumnal world that they suggest. I mean, that record wouldn't be as impactful if it didn't have those string arrangements. And that happened quite often in those days, when a songwriter or an artist would go in, cut tracks and basics, leave the studio, and then the producer would put the strings
Right.
and
Wh-
woodwinds
What
on
about
top of it later.
what about on your new record? So we've been trying to get back to. Uh,
Well, there's no one to blame for the strings and woodwinds on the new record but myself.
so,
So
but
that's
what?
my
But what's your approach to making those string and woodwind arrangements?
Well, my approach is to sit here actually in this very chair and have the listen to have the tracks and sit with, usually with my Mellotron,
Hmm.
because I wish I could. I can't just sit with staff paper and write out an arrangement. So I do it in a very ham-fisted way. I sit here with my Mellotron and I play the parts that I'm hearing in my head, and experiment and um and then layer them that way, and then get them to a point where I can imagine the real thing uh replacing them. And
Mm.
I worked with a great string player here, and lives in my neighborhood, named Matt Combs, who plays he's an amazing violinist, fiddle player, but also plays viola and taught himself cello as well in the last several years. So he can just do the whole thing.
Hmm.
So I'll send him the parts, um, and he can transcribe them, and I can sit with him, and we can make adjustments to make it sound a little more legit. So I'm very lucky in that, and I've done that. I did that in the past. I wrote a string arrangement on a Wilco track
Hmm.
back in 2012, and I've written string arrangements
Which
for
which
a
song was
bunch of the
that?
Autumn Defense records.
Which Wilco track was that?
It's called Black Moon. It's on the album The Whole Love.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that on this new album and the last few ones, the the strings are very restrained, and that they don't get in the way of the vocal, but somehow buoy it up.
Oh well, that I take that as a compliment.
It
It's
was intended as one.
yeah. Well, thanks. It is. I think doing the radio show. I mean, even though I've been interested in this area of pop music, kind of my whole adult life, I think doing the radio show has been very instructional for me, because it's made me listen really intentionally to arrangers and learning about, the names, learning the names of these arrangers, some of which we know who Tony Visconti is, and we know obviously who George Martin is. But, people like Paul Buckmaster, who was a brilliant arranger who arranged, he did a lot of arrangements he did a lot of the early Elton John records, which are big, sweeping
Yeah.
arrangements, like those first few Elton John records, heavily
Yeah.
arranged.
Tumbleweed Connection. And
Yeah, yeah. Madman, Across the Water.
yeah.
He did but he also arranged for the Rolling Stones and then a lot of obscure records that. So I'll sort of like say, okay, well, Paul Buckmaster did this did a this Stones track. What else did he do? And then you look at his CV, and half the things I know and half the things I've never heard. So then I'll go and check that stuff out. But just to like kind of dig in really to these arrangers and listen to their work, I think helped me in arranging for this new record, just kind of giving me some direction on the tone that I wanted the arrangements to
Mhm,
have.
mhm.
And, like I say, I do it in a very ham-fisted way. So there are limitations to the kinds of arrangements I can do. So probably some of the reason that a lot of these arrangements are a bit understated is just because of my skill level. So
So
Talk a little
let's
bit.
talk about
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
why this took so long. It's been 11 years. By the way, the name of the album is Here and Nowhere. It's on Yep Rock, and of course you can get it anywhere you get music. But 11 years between Autumn Defense records. What happened?
well, life happened, I think w- when we put out the last record, it was in 2014. And that was a really busy time, and we were it was kind of on the heels of a very busy time for Wilco. Like, Wilco had a crazy busy touring schedule after The Whole Love. We toured that record for a year and a half, and then we did a Dylan tour, which kind of added another 6 weeks to it. And then we were a bit burnt, bit crispy at the end of that.
Americana, I believe that was called.
Americana.
Yeah.
And then Autumn Defense put out a record, and then we went out and toured in early 2014. And 2014 was a really busy year for John and I in other ways. Like, 2014 I moved to Nashville. I was producing other projects. I went on tour with the Zombies. It was just, when I look back on it, I was like, how in the world did we do all that in that compressed amount of time? So I think after that experience of the last Autumn Defense record, I think we knew we wanted to take a little bit of time away from it just to kind of recharge. And Wilco was busy, and then uh it just, all next thing you know, 10 years has gone by. The
Yeah.
pandemic had a lot to do with that. When you get to 2020, and just everything just went, topsy-turvy, and then having to kind of get through that and come back from that. And then Wilco got really busy, to kind of make up for lost time. So it was just in the blink of an eye, a decade went by, but we were still playing shows. I mean,
Yeah.
uh even though we hadn't been writing or recording, we would still do shows here and there. We play at the different Wilco festivals. We had a few house concerts that we would return to every year, that were really fun and kind of help keep the Autumn Defense engine running. We did a really fun tour in when was that? In 2018. So we kept playing. Every year we did a handful of shows. And so we never really thought of the project as being on hold. We just weren't writing new songs. But John sent me a handful of tunes that he had written around 20, I guess, I can't remember when that was, 2021 or something. And so we started talking about getting back to it. And our first session was in the winter of 2022, and it was just a joy. I mean, as soon as we got into the studio with those guys and in this great studio here where we made the record, I mean, it was instant, instantly joyous, and yeah, so it was I think, worth the wait.
And your rhythm section are known as Hags and G-Wiz. Hags on bass and
Hags,
G-Wiz on drums. Can you
that's
talk
right.
about them a little bit and how long you've been playing with them and what they bring to the project?
Well, they're a huge part of our sound and a huge part of the experience. And G Wiz, his real name is Greg Wazorek. We've known him uh, we've known him since the New Orleans days, and he actually is playing drums on one song on the first record. Uh,
Wow.
and it was originally just going to be a piano ballad, and but I was working at that studio, kind of like adding a few overdubs to it. And I could just imagine drums coming in, but we didn't have access to Ken, and I was working at that studio, the kind of clubhouse studio, magazine sound, where we used to hang out. And Greg Wazorek, G Wiz, was part of that gang that used to hang out at that studio. So I just kind of called him and said, "Hey, you want to?" I think it was like midnight or something. I was like, "Hey, man, you want to?" But it was New Orleans, so it's a late night town. Say, "Hey, man, you
Yeah.
want to come over and I've got, we can do this drum thing and just see if it works." And he came over and it worked perfectly. So he's on the first record. And then he was our drummer from then on out, and plays on all of our records since then. And Hags, James Haggerty, is an old friend of mine from here in Nashville that I met in the 90s when I first started hanging out a lot in Nashville. And I moved here in 1999, for about a year and a half. And so he was part of my musical community and friend group here during those years. So we go way back. And he didn't join up with Autumn Defense until our tour for our third record in 2007. But he just, he was the perfect man for the job. So he's been with us ever since.
Can you talk a little bit about how the Bottom Defense evolved from being John's songs to being both of your songs, and then how it led to you joining Wilco?
When we went in to make our second record, again, John had a handful of songs, and I was writing songs. I was writing songs kind of separately for my own sort of personal project that I was kind of working on off and on for several years. Um, but when it came time to do another record, I had a few things that I felt like would be good for that sound and for that project. So I brought, I think three. I think I have three songs on the next record, Circles. Um, and so yeah, we made that record in here in Nashville at my friend Eli's place, and then I mixed it and kind of overdubbed on it in New York, and we finished it that way. But yeah, we when that record came out in 2003, and we did a lot of shows. We did a big tour for that record. I mean, we got in a van and like toured for like 6 weeks. It was like a real cross country van tour. Pretty ambitious. And that was during the time, so that would have been early 2004. The record came out in late 2003. We did the tour in the spring of 2004, and A Ghost Is Born was finished and was just about to be released. And that's when Jeff decided that he wanted to kind of expand the lineup of the band to go out and tour A Ghost Is Born, because Leroy Bach had left the band, and so there was just there was need for one or two more musicians to kind of flesh out the arrangements. And I was already part of the family, part of the extended Wilco family. I had, Jeff played guitar on one track on Circles, so I'd been in the studio with Jeff. I was kind of just hanging around. Like I was in the studio the night that they did the final mix on the song "I'm Trying to Break Your Heart" from
Wow.
Yankee Hotel Foxtrot.
Yeah.
I was in Chicago hanging out with John. We went by the studio and they were laying down that final mix. I have a real distinct memory of that. And then I remember kind of being around in the studio a bit when they were working on Ghost is Born. And so, yeah, I was just kind of part of the extended family. John and I had done some work at the Loft, for doing the scoring a small independent film. I had, John and I had worked on a record that he and his sister made called Arabella. We did some of that work at the Loft. So I was just kind of part of the extended family. So when it came time to get ready to tour A Ghost is Born, I just kind of got pulled in by osmosis, really. So yeah, that's how that happened.
I'm mindful of your time. We've had you over an hour, but just before we let you go, let's talk about that big picture for a minute. So 2025 is or 2026 is 30 years of Wilco. You've been there for about 21, 22 years
Mhm.
of that. How has that, I mean, besides the fact that Wilco is a very loud rock band, and Tweedy's solo stuff and Autumn Defense is a lot quieter. How do you look at that whole arc of the last 22 years? When you started in Wilco, they were playing places like the 930 Club here in Washington, D.C. Now, when you guys come to town, you sell out Merriweather Post Pavilion or Wolf Trap. Tell us about that journey in the last couple of decades.
Well, I mean, it's a long one. I mean, it is interesting to look back and think of sort of like what my life was like in 2003, in that period right before joining the band. Yeah, and I mean, I joined the band as they were really, kind of cresting. And it was exciting. I mean, it was an exciting time for just in the Wilco universe. It was a very creative period, and I felt it was exciting to get brought into something that was on such a strong musical level. But also to be able to start playing for larger audiences and kind of like experience like what that was like. Um, and that period, from like 2004 to 2012 was a really nice creative zone too. Like kind of leading up to working on The Whole Love, which was an album that's the album that I've probably been the most involved in as far as the arrangements and the production and just having the closest uh, sort of creative relationship with Jeff. And I have really fond memories of that time period. It was very very I think that was the moment because I had already been working as a producer and mixer and doing that kind of work. And I think that was at some point Jeff kind of saw what my skill set was and understood, oh yeah, I can trust him. I can trust this guy in this role. And because that album was kind of a very sprawling sort of situation, and there was no producer, and so there were a lot of ideas flying around, and somebody needed to kind of help bring some focus to things, and that just kind of ended up being me because I was there. and and I think it was just it was the right moment for my particular skill set. It was a good match for the material that was being, being worked on at the time. So that's that that I have nice memories of that
And
time.
what about that unique relationship with Jeff? How is he, in terms of the two of you working together, how is he not like everybody else? Like how does that work between you guys?
Well, it's changed and shifted a lot over the years. I mean, I think at that time, like, that was sort of before Jeff started producing, and he wasn't as comfortable in that space. That's not the case now. I mean, since 2012 and now, he's done a lot of producing. He's way more studio savvy, and it's just it's just a different atmosphere. But at that time, um, and then he and I produced another record together for Johnny Irion, for Johnny, Sarah Lee and Johnny.
Yeah.
Um, and Tom Schick came into the picture, who I knew from New York days and had worked with in the studio a couple of times before. So he and I already knew each other, and we were comfortable with each other in studio. So that kind of just sort of that was sort of the beginnings of kind of what is now the Loft as a recording studio. In
Mhm.
2003, 2004, John had the only Pro Tools rig up at the studio for a couple of years, and that's, so I was up there doing some work with him. The Loft hadn't become a recording studio quite yet in the way that it is now. So
Well, this is great stuff. How are you feeling about it? I think we got some
yeah.
great stuff. Jeff, what are we missing? Anything else?
Well, let me ask one last question. So one of the things that struck me about listening to the new record is that how John wrote almost half the songs, you wrote almost half the songs, you each sing your own songs, and yet it 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 sounds very cohesive, like it's the same sound no matter who wrote it and who sings it. And how do you account for that?
Well, I think at this point, after working, in under the umbrella of the Autumn Defense for 25 years now, um, I think that we just unconsciously know what we're writing towards when we're writing music for the Autumn Defense. It's the Autumn Defense is its own sort of universe now that
Hmm.
we're sort of participating in. So I think we know in the back of our minds when we're writing new material for the project that it's going to emphasize like certain things, certain parts of our musical vocabulary. So I think we're sort of writing for a third mind in a way, and also our band too. It's they're so flexible, they're so musical, and it gives us a lot of freedom to be able to write in this way. Um, so yeah, I think there's like an unconscious conversation going on already before we even get to the studio. When we're
Mm.
presenting when we're presenting material to each other, it's the Autumn Defense has a sound. It has a world that we are that we're trying to sort of
So
exist in.
it's like when you're writing a song, you can tell early on whether this is an Autumn Defense song or something else.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. Um, but and it's not restrictive. I mean, I think it's in a way it's kind of freeing because it allows us to just kind of turn off. You know, we don't have to. We don't have to deliberate too much. We don't really have to explain it to each other. We understand what we're after. Without even really talking about it. And that's a really great place to be as a band or as a project.
Here and Nowhere on Yep Rock Records. It's a great record. I was fortunate enough to see you guys here in Washington, D.C., and you guys put on a great show filled with joy. Are there any more dates coming up in 26 for you guys?
We're working on that now. We're hoping to maybe get overseas a little bit next fall and do some things in Europe, possibly, hopefully. And yeah, there's a lot of moving parts to Autumn Defense and Wilco and our other projects. So we're trying to find the right things to zero in on for next year.
Well, if you can catch Autumn Defense, folks, I suggest you do. Pat Sansone, thank you so much for being part of this.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Enjoyed it.
And this is my final plug. Love,
Oh yeah.
Found Love, the Lost 71 Sessions. Pat, whether you know it or not, you turned me on to it, and it's amazing.
Awesome. Cool. I don't know that
So,
particular collection, so I'm gonna go check it out now.
check it out. All right. Thank you so much. Thanks again for coming.
Cool. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
I always like talking to Pat. He's a thoughtful guy.
Yeah, first time I had that chance, and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. So their new record, Here and Nowhere, as we've said before, is available anywhere you buy your records or listen to your music, and it's on Yep Rock. And we encourage you to check it out and go check out the Autumn Defense if they come to your town. Thanks for another great show, Jeff.
Yeah, it was a good time.
Yeah, we'll see you next time on Hard Rain and Pink Cadillacs.